Hello and welcome to another edition of For the Record. I'm Sean Murphy. My guests today are from the Brain Injury Alliance of Connecticut. Up first is the executive director. Her name is Julie Peters. First time on the show, so welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
So tell everybody what the Brain Injury Alliance of Connecticut is, first of all.
The Brain Injury Alliance of Connecticut is Connecticut's partner in brain injury prevention and resource and recovery. Basically, we were established in 1982 by a group of parents who were really concerned about the lack of supports and services for their children with brain injury. At that time, if you had a brain injury, generally you didn't survive. So the services and supports available in Connecticut were very rare and very minimal. So these parents got together and became a support group of sorts for each other in terms of supporting each other as they dealt with their children. And then the organization was established in 1982 with a very small grant from the Developmental Disabilities Council, started as this support group, and then grew into a statewide organization.
For people who may not understand exactly what a brain injury is, first of all, I would imagine it's sort of a broad umbrella for what a brain injury is, right?
Absolutely. What people think of mostly is you got hit on the head, right? So they think of, and they think that the ways you get a brain injury are automobile accidents, assaults, firearms, that type of thing. But a brain injury really is any jolt to the body or any significant alteration in the brain. Acquired brain injury is the umbrella word for both traumatic brain injury, which are those that you can point to that one point in time that you had an assault to the head or the body. And an acquired brain injury also includes things like strokes, near drowning, and that type of thing. The difference between a brain injury and some type of brain disease or degeneration is that you can point to that moment in time that the brain injury occurred.
People would think of like a blunt trauma force kind of, they think that's a brain injury because it's like, one of those things, but like you were saying, things like stroke. Surprisingly, I wouldn't imagine that people would associate a stroke with a brain injury because they know what a stroke is, but they just don't associate the two, right?
That's right. And oftentimes people don't think of that. But they're all encompassing in the word acquired brain injury.
Is the brain still that one magnificent thing in our body that we still don't know a lot about?
Absolutely. We are just at the very, very surface of what we know about the brain. And in terms of brain injuries, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about brain injuries. Number one is that you have to hit your head, first of all.
Right.
You don't have to hit your head. It can be any forceful jolt to the body.
Yeah, we have someone from our staff here who her daughter got whiplash and there was no contact, but that the brain kind of rolling around in the noggin, I guess, can actually cause that, right?
Absolutely.
Wow.
It's the same thing with blast injuries that we're seeing with our veterans coming back from war. It's being near that explosion that can cause movement in your head. So people often think that if they haven't hit their head, they don't have a brain injury, or if they haven't lost consciousness. That's another common myth, that you have to lose consciousness to have a brain injury, and that's not the case at all.
Is there a lot of situations where people completely unaware that they have or had a brain injury, whether it be a concussion or anything else, and they just kind of continue on with their lives and not realizing what happened?
Absolutely. You'll see people who may have the initial headache, or they may have some nausea or dizziness or something. They don't really track that to the brain injury. And maybe some of these don't show up right away. Maybe it's when they go back to work or school and they're having to do more concentration that they see some of the symptoms and signs. And also, many times a brain injury will not show up on your typical MRI or CAT scan. And so someone could have a brain injury and it doesn't even show if they go to the doctor. So it's a lot of times it's that discussion about what are your signs and symptoms in order to diagnose whether or not you have a brain injury.
How has the technology advanced as far as being able to identify a brain injury? You mentioned the MRIs. Have those things improved in that kind of technology to be able to identify it?
Significantly.
Yeah.
And this is where I'm going to tell you that this is where Deb will know
Okay.
a lot more about this than I will. She'll be able to answer all those kinds of questions.
What is prevalent now in the real world that you are seeing as far as brain injuries are concerned? Is it strokes? What is it that people are experiencing more of now?
Well, because it's only newly thought of as a brain injury, concussion is the big one.
Yeah.
That's where we are getting the most calls to our helpline. We have an 800 number that we have brain injury specialists who will answer the calls and very specific questions that can be anything from, I think my son or daughter has had a concussion and I don't know where to go to for help, to people who have significant lifelong issues and such. And so it may be I need help finding a neuropsychologist or a rehab hospital. So our brain injury specialists really respond to about 4,000 contacts each year from people with a wide variety of issues and ways that they receive their brain injury.
Sports is a big concussion thing going on now, and there's a lot in the media, even the big leagues, the NFL and all the leagues as far as concussions. And again, I know that we'll get into that in the second segment, but that is sort of a buzz term that people are hearing a lot in the news these days, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. There's so much more awareness now that we're seeing the changes and the things that the NFL are doing to combat having more concussions.
It's just things that don't you think that people are thinking about as we learn more about it. Suddenly, you realize that maybe they're younger and younger experiencing it in an unfortunate way, but that's just part of life, right?
Absolutely. The most brain injuries occur either in the very younger children or the very older adults when it comes to falls and such. And that's a big area for children in terms of falling from playground equipment and that type of thing.
As executive director of the Brain Injury Alliance of Connecticut, what are some of your duties that you deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Well, because we are both a resource in recovery and a partner in prevention, we have a dual mission. So part of what we do is the prevention piece. So we have our Director of Community Outreach and Education will go out and talk to students in the schools. She'll talk to the community about ways to prevent a brain injury because prevention really is the only cure. So it's really important. So everything from the simple things like wearing a seatbelt to never getting into a car with someone who's been drinking and driving to wearing the appropriate helmet for the appropriate activity.
A lot of common sense stuff.
A lot of common sense things, and also but things that people don't really think about because you don't think about a brain injury until it happens to you. So she does a lot of community education about prevention and ways to prevent it. Then the second half of our mission is really that resource and recovery, and that's where we work with families, individuals with brain injuries, the professionals who support them, their caregivers. We really are answering their questions regarding that. And we are the only statewide organization that provides the services we do entirely free of charge. So either you can access those services through our helpline, through by contacting us via Facebook or email. We have a very thorough website that people can go to.
What's on the website, by the way?
The website includes everything from basic information about brain injuries, concussions, that type of thing, to resources to go to for help, to information about our support groups. We have 30 support groups statewide, and each of them is a little bit different in addition to being in different parts of the state. Some of them are for caregivers or parents. Some of them are for veterans. Some of them are for individuals who may be working but not able to share with the people they work with the fact that they have a brain injury and dealing with some things as a result of that. So they all have a little bit different character, but the most important thing they are is a way for peers to support each other through what can be a very challenging time.
And support groups are so important because they're before the internet, people didn't necessarily have a means to sort of reach out, ask for help, and get help. But support groups are fantastic, aren't they?
They really are. And we always say, if you go to one support group and it doesn't quite meet your needs, go to another one because you'll be amazed at the differences between them. And some of them do all kinds of social events, which can be really important because for someone with a brain injury, because life as you know it has changed so much, oftentimes those friends and family and people who are close to you fall away. You're not able to speak in the same way you were able to before. You're not able to communicate, or your personality may have changed a little bit. So life can be very isolating and lonely. So sometimes the support groups, it's just even that social aspect that can be so important. Just getting together with with people and sharing some of your joys and challenges, I think can be important.
Yeah, you mentioned brain injuries, but we don't think necessarily of the psychological aspect of it, and that's where the support groups can really come in.
Right, exactly. People who've gone through or are going through the same thing that you are.
On some of those support groups, I don't want to touch too much on this because, like, for example, the veterans, I think it's important just to acknowledge that there are support groups for them, too, as far as brain injuries go. I know it's a sensitive issue, but those kind of support groups are there for them, too, right?
Correct. And the support groups really, those are ones that we limit the membership in them. For instance, it's only for combat veterans. So these are people who have been through what you have been through. And because it's quite different oftentimes than someone who's sustained a brain injury in a different way, it's really important to be able to get support from peers and people who have been in combat and kind of know that kind of thing. So I think it's critical. One of the biggest issues we have is letting the veterans know that they exist so they'll come to the support groups.
That's a good point, yeah, getting the word out there. And one way to do that is you're on social media, too. It's important to be involved with that because that's where the people are, and it's very interactive. You can comment on it. It's very, so
Absolutely.
you have to be there, too.
Right.
And you're on social media.
Yes, we
and
are.
you can get through links on your website, which we didn't get a chance to mention. So what is the website for people to go and see?
The website is www.biact.org.
All right, Julie Peters, Executive Director of Brain Injury Alliance of Connecticut. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you so much for having me.
We will take a short break and come back. I'm Sean Murphy. This is For the Record. Stay with us. Welcome back to For the Record. I'm Sean Murphy. My guest for the second segment is Deb Shalansky. She's the Director of Community Outreach and Support for the Brain Injury Alliance of Connecticut. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us, Sean.
One of the things that we talked about in the break is an 800 number that you'd want to just let everybody know about. We'll also put a graphic up on the screen, too, but what is that number?
It's 800-278-8242.
And what is that number for?
That is for our helpline, and we have brain injury specialists on staff who can respond to any questions from someone who has a brain injury, from a family member, a caregiver, and from professionals within the state.
So, Director of Community Outreach and Support, what is that? What's that mean? It's a fancy title.
Not really.
No?
I oversee the support groups throughout the state, and Julie talked about the fact that we have about 30 support groups throughout all of Connecticut, and the different support groups they all have different personalities. So in a sense, if you go to one support group and it doesn't seem to meet your needs, you can try a different support group. But as Julie mentioned, we have support groups for veterans, for individuals who have sustained a stroke, for people who are looking to go back to school or work, and also for just caregivers, and then for anyone with a brain injury.
And I know that we already mentioned this, but you just can't emphasize enough how important and how helpful these types of groups are for individuals and families even, right?
Well, when you have a brain injury, it's very difficult for individuals who aren't in the same place as you to understand what your challenges are. And when someone who has a brain injury or a caregiver or family member goes to a support group, they realize that they're not alone. There are other people who can understand what is taking place. They don't have to explain everything.
You touched on something interesting there, and it's not just the individual dealing with the brain injury, but also those around him, whether it be family or a caregiver. They suffer too, don't they?
Absolutely. They've known a particular individual, and that person's life has changed, and that's impacted their lives as well. So the families have to come to an understanding that there's kind of a new normal.
Let's talk about some buzz terms, some buzzwords that we mentioned in the first segment. And one is concussions, because when you think of brain injuries, that's one of the big things that people associate, and that's concussions. And it's big in the news now, especially with sports, kids, and even adults in professional leagues. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, so you hit on the point that people associate concussions with sport injuries. But you could drop your pen under the table and go to pick it up, and you could whack yourself on the table or on a cabinet, and you can end up with a concussion as a result of that. So I will talk about it in terms of sports, but it can happen in any way. So one of the biggest myths with concussions is that you have to lose consciousness, and that's not true. In only about 10% of the instances, someone will lose consciousness. And you also don't have to hit your head to have a concussion. I think Julie touched on that as well. With brain injury, you can hit your head or your body, and if the brain moves back and forth at a significant enough force, you can end up with a concussion.
And one of the unfortunate things about sports in general is you're kind of taught to, sort of walk it off, you know what I mean? So you'll go back in to continue playing when that's the worst thing you can do. They might not even realize that you've had a concussion.
Absolutely. Well, in the state of Connecticut, we now have some laws that help to protect student athletes. And in 2010, we were one of the first states in the country that passed a law requiring coaches to pull an athlete out of practice or a game, and then that athlete's going to have to go and see a medical professional who is knowledgeable about concussion and can manage the concussion before that individual can go back both to school and to athletics. And most recently, in the past legislative session, we had additional laws that were passed. And in the coming year, there are going to be requirements where parents have to have information, sign off so that they recognize that they understand concussion and they've been informed. Student athletes have to have information, and then we're looking at the coaching and the education that is required for the coaches, and it's being revamped so that it's up to date.
What are your thoughts on parents, a lot of parents these days, expressing concern and in a lot of cases maybe not even allowing their kids to play certain sports, heavy or high impact sports, football in general, just because of their concerns about that? It could be injuries in general, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll talk about brain injuries.
Well, I think it's important to be aware, but education is really the biggest factor. And if the parents are educated on the signs and the symptoms of concussions, as well as the athletes, and if there's early detection and the child gets the appropriate medical intervention, then really athletics are really important in so many different ways to the general health of individuals that I think as long as a parent, in the public school system, this is now being taken care of by the legislature because we now have laws in place. But when you come to youth sports, there isn't anything at this point that is going to protect the students directly. We don't have anyone overseeing the coaches. And so there are certain questions that parents should really be asking when a child is involved in the youth sport organizations. And we will put something, I'm going to put something on our website when we get back so that there will be questions up that parents can look at as to what they might want to ask a youth sport organization before they enroll their child in those organizations.
When you're talking real young, the brain is still sort of forming, or it's not at its where it's still it's more haphazard to get struck, I would imagine, right?
Well, I think the more important aspect is that the brain, as you said, is still developing. And so as a result, if someone sustains a concussion, generally, this is not definite, but generally an adolescent is going to have a longer recovery than an adult because the brain is still developing.
And that's something that could affect you for the rest of your life too, if something happens.
Absolutely.
That young in life.
One hit sadly can affect your life permanently.
So concussions are something that people would associate as a brain injury, but they might be surprised to learn that a stroke, can be associated with a brain injury too. Talk about that a little bit.
If someone has a stroke, then there's an impact on the brain. There can be deprivation of oxygen, which also can happen when someone has a heart attack. If someone has meningitis, that can also impact the brain. So there are lots of different ways that someone can end up with a brain injury, not just a concussion.
Things you might not have even thought of as related to brain injuries, but then you realize that is the case too. And what is your biggest concern?
My biggest concern is education.
Yeah.
Because if individuals aren't educated about what is a brain injury and how can you manage a brain injury, you can't prevent a brain injury. The only prevention, you can't cure a brain injury. The only cure basically is to prevent it to begin with.
Did you want to expound a little bit more on what Julie was talking about in the first segment as far as misconceptions, to kind of continue on that people, it could be related to the concussions, but just in general, brain injuries and misconceptions?
Well, Generally, if someone has a broken arm or they're in a wheelchair, you know that there is some challenge or some injury to that individual. But brain injury is considered the silent epidemic because people walk around and there's nothing that you can look at and say, oh, that individual has a brain injury. And yet that individual can have serious challenges on a day-to-day basis, and in terms of their processing, their cognitive skills, their balance, physical, emotional. Brain injury can really impact the entire being.
What is the best way to get the word out, to get kids educated? Just start as early as possible in the school system, and how do you get in there to kind of get the word out?
Well, one of the things that I do as the Director of Community Outreach and Support is I will go out into the school systems, and we don't charge for our services. And I will go to any school and develop, I have certain programs that are in place. Again, they're on our website, which is www.biact.org. But I will also develop a specific program based upon what the educators want. And I can go and teach the children based upon their age about brain injury, about general safety, and also I do professional education programs as well.
I asked Julie in the first segment, like, what her day-to-day duties are. You kind of explained it a little bit there too, but maybe in general, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? You go into schools?
I'm going to schools. I'm overseeing the support groups. I visit some of the support groups. I also run a large conference that we have every March. March is Brain Injury Awareness Month.
That's one of the big events that you have coming. I know it's not until March, but talk about like some of those big events.
Well, we're pretty excited this year that we have Dr. Robert Cantu, who is one of the foremost specialists on concussion. So the conference is not just about concussion, but we happen to have him as one of our speakers. And then we have a survivor named David Grant, and he is going to talk about his brain injury as the keynote. And then in addition, we are looking to have speakers talk about behavioral techniques for professionals as to how they would work with individuals. So the conference, it's really the only conference in the state of Connecticut that is directly and solely on brain injury.
How many people attend that?
We have between 250 and 300 professionals.
All right. Well, let's take one more break and come right back before we wrap it up. I'm Sean Murphy. This is For the Record. Stay with us. So that is just about our show for today. Again, some helpline info for people if they want to have questions or they have concerns. Where can they call?
They can call 800-278-8242.
And the website?
And the website is www.biact.org. And we do not charge for our services, so please call us if you have a question.
Deb Shalansky, the Director of Community Outreach and Support. It's a pleasure having you on the show today. Learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of For the Record. You can see this show and many others on our YouTube site. Until next time, take care.